And
Okay, perfect. Hey y'all, thanks for being here with me today. I'm Ava Smithing, the Advocacy and Operations Director at the Young People's Alliance, and I am joined by some amazing activists, organizers, and creators to kind of unpack the craziness that was the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing of the big tech CEOs last week and get some genuine opinions of some of the young people who are involved in the moment. Uh, Sam, if you want to go ahead first and introduce yourself.
for sure, I'm a current junior at UNC Chapel Hill, and I lead a group called the Young People's Alliance, which is advocating for issues that young people care about, specifically right now focusing on combating the youth mental health crisis and social media's role in that.
Sure, and Ben, you can go.
Yeah, my name is Ben Spallis. 21 years old. I'm a Neil Postman lover. He's the one who got me interested in looking at how media can influence the message and influence people. And that led me to post on TikTok. I post on TikTok to try and help people get off their phones or go to bed at night or process emotions. And I was lastly um, invited to be an editor for Jonathan Haidt's most upcoming book. It's called The Anxious Generation, and it's basically looking at the relationship between the mental health crisis and social media right now. So that got me interested in designing for us.
Perfect. And I guess speaking of Design It For Us, Saman, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yep. Hi, everyone. My name is Saman Qureshi. I co-chair the Design It For Us Coalition, a group of youth activists driving state and federal policy to protect kids and teens online. I'm a current senior at American University, 21 years old. And yeah, I got into this movement first to safeguard elections and democracy as it relates to social media. And then that evolved quickly into the youth mental health space as it relates to digital well-being and social media.
Okay, perfect. And last but not least,
Hi everyone, I'm Sanvi. I'm the executive director at the Youth Power Project. I'm also a second year at UC Berkeley. And yeah, the Youth Power Project, we focus a lot on experience-driven policymaking, trying to bring more young people into health and particularly mental health oriented policy work. But more broadly, we focus on civic engagement. And a big portfolio for us is bringing survivors of child sexual abuse material into conversations around CSAM and online safety. So really excited to be here and chat with y'all.
right? And this is incredibly relevant given the focus of last week's hearing. But I just wanted to start by kind of diving into how everyone's feeling about that. Right before the hearing started, as the senators started rolling into the room, Zaman leaned over to me and he asked if it has hit me yet. And I was curious for for those of you who are in here today, when that moment for you hit you, for you to realize the gravity of the situation, the fact that there were a lot of eyes on this traditionally kind of in the background movement, and if it hasn't hit you yet, when that moment is going to be, like what you need to see for you to realize how real it is. And we can go backwards this time, Sanvi, if you want to start.
Absolutely. So I wasn't actually in the hearing room in person. So I think it was a very different experience on the West Coast, trying to kind of keep up with everything that was going on. I was watching the hearing in class. I was in a tech policy class. So it was a little bit interesting that nobody in the room was talking about the fact that this major hearing on Section 230, and not really, it wasn't even focused mostly on Section 230, but, bits and pieces there where we're talking about it. And that part was really interesting. And I feel like it had hit me when I was watching it in class, but that dissonance with like the fact that none of my peers around me were paying attention to this, despite it being something that we were talking about academically, was a little bit interesting for a while. And so I think it hit me in the sense that I, what I was hearing in the hearing sounded promising, but at the same time I was really skeptical. Like the skepticism, especially because we've had hearings like this in the past that have yielded urgency or have yielded dialogue on the issue, but haven't actually done anything to advance pertinent legislation or pertinent policy measures, was a little bit interesting. So I would say that it hit me and it struck me that we were having these kinds of conversations, that they were bringing survivors to the table, and that there seemed to be a lot of attention being paid to the harms that have occurred. But I think ultimately at the end of it, at the end of the day, I was a little bit um, more apprehensive about the fact that it didn't seem like, I guess I wasn't as hopeful about spill over beyond that hearing, like what exactly that would look like. And so I think for me to really feel like, feel like it would hit me, I think will have to be when we actually see some of the policies that they were discussing in print, and we see real movement being made. Because yeah, they can discuss bipartisanship and they can talk about shaking hands across the aisle, but until that legislation moves beyond committee and gets to the floor, passes both, not just the Senate, but also we receive that attention in the House, I feel like it'll be hard for me and hard for a lot of folks, at least on my end in the coalition that we work with, the Coalition of Survivors, to really feel like their needs are being seen and heard by these lawmakers.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely valid. And Ben, I'm curious for you how this felt, because this is one of your first times being in a situation like this, right?
Yeah, so I thought this was all very, very cool. I very much like I'm a social butterfly by heart, so I like going out and talking to people and connecting people, seeing people in person. So I think it was like three moments when it hit me of like what was happening. The first one was like on the train ride. It was like 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. I had an avocado toast sandwich from Dunkin' Donuts, and I swear to God, I haven't been that relaxed in like a really long time. I was like in the Zen mode, man. Like and that sandwich tasted so good. Like it was just like I don't know, it was orchestral. It was amazing. So, anyways, that was one thing, because it just felt very important. The second moment where it kind of hit me is in a different way when Zaman earlier when we had met had said, "Yeah, we only have 4 reserved seats like near the front," and then I was like, "Dang, okay, so like." And then, but he didn't tell me that I was going to be one of those seats. So I was just like, oh, wow, that's okay. Like, I was just like, I could feel my heart sink just like 1 degree, but I was still excited to be a part of the group and stuff like that. So I was like, okay, cool, cool, cool. We'll have to figure this out. And then he was like, we all got through security and he was like, Ben, I want you here. And then it was like, I was one of the 4 seats. Then I felt like a lot more responsibility. I was like, oh my gosh, now I'm like in the White House. That's crazy. And now I got to like do something, you know? So but like in a good way, I was looking forward to the opportunity. And then the last time, and the kind of the most impactful way that it hit me was on the train ride back. And I saw on TikTok that everyone on the platform, seemingly everyone, was siding with the big tech CEOs, that they were taking this Mark Zuckerberg apology, and then they were blaming parents, and that they were saying that people, it's surprising to them that parents couldn't take responsibility over the kids, or why don't they just take away the phone, and comments like that. And so that it was in that moment where like that day was not, it was like equally one of the most exciting days I've had in a very long time, and equally one of the most depressing days I've had in a very long time, because it was a lot of progress, and then it also showed me how much damn work is ahead of us. And so I think that kind of third one was the most impactful.
Right. Right. And we'll definitely talk about that third point you made a little bit further down the line. And I had the same kind of moment with Saman where I knew we only had 4 seats. And then he was like, oh, Ava, you're going to be in there too. I was like, okay, yeah, cool, cool. What about you, Saman? When was it for you?
Yeah, I think it was right before the hearing started. And the photographers were lining up. The photographers kind of crouch in front of the dais where the senators sit, and they're all like poised. And we're like, there'd been a moment of lull. People had kind of entered the room, and then they kind of like, yeah, were poised for the entry of the CEOs. And it was at that moment where I was like, oh, wow, this is going to be a historic day for a number of reasons. And we're here to witness it and be ultimately ended up being a part of it as well. I think I agree with all the comments that have been made so far. The sobering reality of the experience was that on the one hand, you had Mark Zuckerberg apologizing to families, to parents of victims who've lost their children to social media harm or had tremendous harms happen to their children. That's the first time that I can remember that Mark Zuckerberg has had to face the harms of his own platform head on. Typically, it's been his deputies who've done that job: Nick Clegg, Sheryl Sandberg, Joel Kaplan, very senior people at Meta who've been tasked with taking care of that responsibility. This is the first time I saw him do this. And then, I mean, the very next day or the day after, Meta reports 20 billion plus in earnings, 20% rise in share value. And it just completely obliterates the reality that we're in. On the front page of every major newspaper across the country, you had Zuckerberg apologizing to these parents, and then, you know, on Wall Street, in Silicon Valley, uh, the the predictions and futures of Meta as a company have never been higher before. So I think that juxtaposition was sobering, and it makes us think, as and kind of Ava, as you said at the top, you know, we're in this movement pretty pretty deeply. Like we're participating in this almost every single day. Um, and there are folks around the country who will probably never know that that hearing even happened. And also, you know, are not quite aware of the issues, or are at least not cognizant that these are problems that we're experiencing. Um, so yeah, those were my kind of my overall takeaways from the experience.
Right. What about you, Sam?
Yeah, like Zaman said, I think these are complex topics, and talking about the idea of someone getting addicted to online content is something that takes a little while to explain and to educate a lot of people on. And it took a long time for me to understand this issue too when I was scrolling on my phone and so frustrated at myself for being unable to get off, that it wasn't just a me problem, but that these apps are designed to keep you online for as long as possible. So what I was really impressed by during the hearing was how the senators all seem to have a really good handle on these issues. You know, like any young person is well aware of how our legislature, how our Congress is elderly and isn't really in touch with what's going on for young people. But I really felt like a lot of elected officials on that panel had done a very good job at talking to young people who were experiencing the issue and understanding the issue, especially compared to some of the previous hearings we've seen in the past. Now, like Ben said, it is really unfortunate that the few moments that weren't actually aligned with the real issues was what most of people on social media took away from the hearing. But I wish that more young people would watch the hearing in full and see how these issues really do need to be addressed.
Right. And that's something I want to get into. So in Senator Graham's opening statement, he says, Mr. Zuckerberg, you and the companies before us, I know you don't mean it to be so, but you have blood on your hands. You have a product that's killing people. And this was a huge quote. This was what a lot of companies picked up to be their, or journalists picked up to be their headline was, you have blood on your hands. And I'm curious, from your perspective, Ben, do you feel he has blood on your hands? And as someone who's actively engaged in the social media conversation about this, for people to turn around and not necessarily think that to be true and to kind of take his side on that, do you see any validity in that perspective and that opinion? Like Zaman said, before the hearing, all the photographers were crouched down, and we noticed that they were very disproportionately in front of Zuckerberg's nameplate. Do you think that there's any part of him that's being scapegoated when this is an industry-wide issue?
I think that the I think discourse around responsibility is most fruitful when it's focused on our ability to respond. It's what needs to be done and what needs to be changed. I think discourse around responsibility is least fruitful when it's around kind of this pointing fingers, you know, where do we stop the chain of events to point at a person and say that it's their fault. In terms of, this isn't to dodge a question, but it is also to explain a hesitance that I have with even kind of thinking about that dialogue, because I think this is one of the reasons why that apology, I guess, backfired, or it definitely didn't go again. It definitely wasn't received in the way that the senator had wanted it, because it instantly strips all the nuance from the situation. I mean, I don't know what it's I don't know what makes it difficult for a parent to parent a child with social media, as much as I don't know what information I'm missing on Mark Zuckerberg's side. But what I do seem to know, as much as the evidence I have to support it says, social media in the way that it is right now is seriously harming people and is killing people, and that needs to change, regardless of the kind of contingencies or incentives involved.
Right. And I think it's really interesting, and I'd be curious to hear your opinion on this, Sanvi, as someone who wasn't there, because being in the hearing and having him turn around and apologize, I couldn't even really almost pay attention to what he was saying, just because in the heat of the moment, I think everyone was holding their breath and like grabbing onto their neighbor. We were just like absolutely taken aback that he was doing it. But to go from his opening hearing of saying there's no correlation between social media usage and mental health to then later in the hearing turning around and apologizing, what do you make of that?
I thought that was something I thought about a lot because, you know, I was honestly when I first when the hearing first started and in his opening statement was essentially just him being like, yeah, this is a problem, but like it's not our fault and like we side with parents and we're implementing XYZ control so that parents like can monitor their kids, but we're not going to do the monitor. We're not going to do anything beyond that. We're going to kind of lay that responsibility on users and their families and give them the prerogative to decide how they want to I guess leverage the features that we can provide them. That was like the sentiment at the beginning. And then for him to like kind of turn around and apologize and be like, I'm so sorry for the harms that you have gone through. I feel like honestly, almost in a weird way, like kind of I think the way I interpreted it at first I was like, this is kind of like a half-baked apology and you know he's asked to say something so he's going to apologize, but on the other hand I feel like in the back of my mind, it just feels like another way to shift the blame back onto users, just to be like, hey, we are doing what we can and we have done enough. It's ultimately on you, and I'm sorry that this is happening to you, and I'm sorry this happened. And almost like he's kind of like trying to present a more empathetic front rather than like be an urgent front to like take more action on Meta's shoulders to do more. Because I also noticed that throughout the hearing there was this sentiment that you know Meta is a leader in combating image-based abuse material online. He talked a lot about the number of images that they've taken down. Like he talked about Take It Down. He talked about their collaboration with NCMEC. He talked about being endorsed by NCMEC. He talked a lot about the amount of money they've invested into hiring personnel to and also creating technology to moderate content on their platforms. I feel like there was a lot of like it was very defensive, and I feel like the apology was definitely a defense mechanism, and I think that's what kind of sucked about it was you know like yeah there are serious harms that you know Meta has unfortunately facilitated on their platforms, yet all we're going to get is an apology, and I think that's where it's going to stop from them, and there needs to be more beyond just an apology and prevent and reactionary defense mechanisms that do nothing to actually address the issue at hand.
Yeah, and I think to Sanvi's point, like it's clear these tech CEOs will say anything they can to make this what they see as a PR crisis to just go away. They'll say, "Oh, there's no problem in the first place, but if there was a problem, we're doing everything that we can do to combat it. But also, these other things that you're suggesting wouldn't be possible for us to do." So they don't have any clear basis for anything they're saying. They're just saying anything they think will make this go away.
Right. And I think in that apology, it also, like you said, it's defensive. It takes the blame off of them and it shifts it right back on to Congress. They say, well, I apologize. I'm sorry. It's your turn to regulate me. And that's something else I want to talk about. So Senator Graham also said, and he made a very funny joke about it. Elizabeth Warren and Lindsey Graham have nothing in common. I promised her I would say that publicly. The only thing worse than me doing a bill with Elizabeth Warren is her doing a bill with me. And I think that really demonstrates the bipartisan support behind this. And I'm curious, Zaman, your take as someone who's so actively involved in the politics of this. If not bipartisan support, what is missing in this movement that has been able to push it forward? Like, why are we still where we are if you have people like Senator Warren and Senator Graham working together?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, just briefly coming back to the apology, if you listen to the apology, he says, I'm sorry for what you all have gone through, not I'm sorry for what my products have caused to you. And so, even in that of itself, he's kind of removed the responsibility that he needed to take during the apology. A lot of parents who were there afterwards and in the press said it felt like a pretty empty apology. But yeah, I mean, Ava, to your point about bipartisanship, I mean, no offense to Senator Graham and Senator Warren, but their bill hasn't gone anywhere. It's great to propose regulatory structures that are going to be able to regulate social media, but we're in an election year. Congress has barely been able to agree on a spending package, let alone, broad bipartisan support for whether it's the border or regulating social media companies. So, you have that dichotomy on one hand. On the other hand, you have people like Tom Cotton, who came to the hearing, had a list of pretty xenophobic questions for TikTok CEO Xiao Chou, and then went viral on TikTok. So I think the irony to these hearings is that we know that a lot of congressional hearings turn into political theater. And some of these senators capitalize on that political theater and fundraise off of that. So it's all good and well kind of coming in with your proposed regulatory solutions, and then not having any action to show behind it is pretty empty. There were definitely senators there who, in my opinion, were there to offer genuine questions, remarks, and support for legislation that they've actually worked hard on. A special shout out to Senator Blackburn for, all who we may disagree on other issues around, was strong in not only presenting the perspective of the Meta lawsuits, but also our perspective as young people. For those who haven't read in the press, Design It For Us wore, and in conjunction with YPA, wore t-shirts that said, "I'm worth more than $270. And when Senator Blackburn asked Mark Zuckerberg about that figure, we stood up behind him, and he was kind of forced to look at us. And Yoel Golko, who's one of our advocates who was there with us, afterwards was like, he looked me right in the eye. He looked me dead in the eye. But I think that moment is like indicative of the challenges of bipartisanship that we're seeing here. You have real legislative proposals that have gotten the support of committee members, of leadership in Congress, and then failed to advance for one reason or another. And it's like, we can't protect kids online. How are we going to be able to do any of the other things that we want to do, whether it's competition policy or privacy? This is such a basic thing at its core that we should be doing, that as a country and as a Congress, we've really failed to do.
Right. And I want to quote Senator Kennedy here, because I was hoping that we would kind of get into this conversation as to how it's paradoxical that social media is what's preventing us from passing social media legislation. When you have people who are kind of putting on, like you said, this theater and trying to get a platform from it. So Kennedy says, you take this abundance of personal information and then you develop Instagrams to punch people's hot buttons, or algorithms to punch people's hot buttons, and steer them to information that punches their hot buttons again and again and again to keep them coming back and keep them staying longer. And as a result, your users see only one side of an issue. And so to some extent, your platform has been killing the field for truth, hasn't it? And Kennedy's his entire line of questioning was a little bit humorous. He has quite the persona around him, but I think out of all the senators, he, in this statement right here, almost demonstrated that he has such an in-depth understanding of how these algorithms are working. And I'm curious to hear your perspective, Sam. Do you think that there's validity behind this, like that it is a killing field for truth? And how do these issues kind of all overlap, and what could be done about it?
Absolutely. I think social media has been great in a lot of way in terms of diversifying where people can get their information from, who can be an influencer. But at the same time, because of the way these algorithms are designed, instead of that making people have broader perspectives and be exposed to new ideas, that has been used by social media companies to allow people to confirm their existing biases see things that, you know, if you're a Republican, all Democrats are evil. If you're a Democrat, all Republicans are evil. Anything that will make you angry because that's going to keep you engaged. Or worse, things that will, especially for young teens, make them insecure, especially as we get into eating disorders and issues like that. That is the basis for their business model at this point, is addicting users to an infinite scroll feed or an explore page that will confirm their biases and upset them, because that will keep people as long online for as long as possible. And it's really unfortunate to see, because social media has such uh potential to be this place where we could all learn more about the world and learn more about each other and connect with people who we couldn't normally connect with. It's just about fixing these design features so that social media can actually play that role, rather than just being a place where people go to get angry and scroll for a couple hours.
Right. And in Zuckerberg's response to this, he said, I think that there's more that needs to be explored there, but I don't think that we can solve that by ourselves. So he's kind of asking for regulation here in this sense. And Sam, I'm curious, your thoughts on, like, do you see this as him owning that he needs regulation here, or am I reading too far into that?
I would guess that he didn't mean he wanted regulation. I think his argument would probably have been that they can't do it themselves, that, hey, this is just the nature of the online world, which is so far from the truth. I mean, we all grew up on an Instagram that existed before extremely addictive algorithms, and we have some idea of what the open internet looked like before the modern age where everything was dominated by big tech. So we know what the internet can be, and we know what it is able to accomplish through better designed platforms. And I mean, to the point about Instagram, they still were able to be a successful business before they turned on these addictive algorithms. So it's absolutely not true that there's nothing they can do in this case. And I think if Zuckerberg is not willing to take responsibility and have Facebook make those change, or Meta make those changes themselves, then the government should go ahead and regulate them.
Right. And I want to explore that a little bit further, because you're right. We all did have the experience of using Instagram as more of an open tool, more of an authentic place for expression, before it was monetized so heavily. And so, to use another Zuckerberg quote, he says, every day, teens and young people do amazing things on our services. They use our apps to create things, express themselves, explore the world around them, feel more connected to the people they care about. This was in his opening statement. And I'm curious to hear your perspective, Ben, as someone who does create online, what self-expression means in a world where you're also susceptible to hate and social comparison, and you're wondering whether or not your content is going to go viral, because that's kind of what these algorithms do to the platform. Like, how can you be expected to express yourself genuinely when you're kind of competing for attention with influencers and celebrities who are paid to express themselves on these platforms?
That's an interesting question. Like, how is the idea of self-expression influenced by kind of the context of social media?
Yeah, like, how can you, what does it mean to self-express in such a commercialized zone of expression where people are able to monetize their expression?
Yeah.
You express if you don't want to monetize.
Yeah. I was thinking about this on the walk here. I think that, you know, one way of viewing languages is that, you know, there's like English, Spanish, French, Chinese, and that's like a 2D version of language. I think like a third dimension to language that we can include is form. And when you look at people who express themselves, the poets who do that really well spend lots of time doing that, but the poets who do that are not the long form video content creators, who are not the novelists, who are not the speech writers, and that you can develop proficiency in a certain form. I think with the online format, I think it can be harmed by the kind of context that is very short form and commercialized and that kind of thing. I find a lot of people on the app don't stand for values that I really kind of care about in marketing products that they do, or acting in really kind of robotic and cartoonish ways to try and get attention and get people to engage with them. But I have also seen people who have really taken the tools and the atmosphere of what this kind of three-dimensional space of TikTok is, or short form content is, and express themselves or expressed art in a way that has been that couldn't have been done any other way. So
Right. And I think that's really beautiful that it allows so many people to express themselves. But I think on the other side of that, and anyone can jump in on this one, and Kennedy, again, to quote Kennedy, says, does your user agreement still suck? And I think what he was getting at is, do people understand that they're sacrificing their personal data to be able to use this platform for free and to be able to express themselves like that, which is such a beautiful thing. But I guess my question is, how would you explain to someone who doesn't understand the gravity of what their data is, why their data is important? Because it's an intangible thing, right? This isn't a material object, but it is still an expression of yourself. Like, how can we generate urgency for people behind
Yeah.
why their data is important?
I've had people look at my profile and be inspired by it and tell me that they want to create content. And I've told them don't. I've told them that if you want to have an impact, do it in person. How I have my impact is I do it in person. When I look at the way that TikTok treats me as a content creator, um, I'm quite appalled trying to imagine myself as a younger kid and the kind of effect that their messages would have on me. Um, they are quite blatant and they have no shame or reservations that they know attention and fame and viewership and virality is exactly what these people are looking for. And so they coax you with prestige like it's a carrot on a stick. And today I keep getting pestered to post more photos because it gets, they ram this in my head 1.9% or 1.9 times more comments and 2.6 times more views. And they'll tell that to you over and over and over again. And so in terms of the way that the app is designed to kind of exploit you to want to post more or want to, you know, quote unquote express yourself, but in this very formulaic and numbers based way, I hate it. I think it's awful and I wouldn't recommend it for anybody. I think it's just, I mean, oh, actually, I would recommend it, but I'd recommend it for someone who's a competent adult, you know, someone
Right, there you go. Not a child. Exactly. Well, and the same thing with children. I mean, you're not supposed to be collecting the data of children, and by the collection of data, they show you content that you would be more interested in. So I'm curious, Sanvi, what you think the value in that exchange for your data and viewership is.
Definitely. I think for kids, I mean, it creates like a race to the top to create something that you think others are going to like. I don't even think it's a sense of self-expression anymore, but more a sense of trying to fit a mold. But it's kind of like it's weird because I think it's paraded as individualism. It's paraded as like, oh, I'm on this platform and I'm going to express this authentic version of myself. But it's really just a version of yourself that seems authentic, but is like highly motivated or highly like I think selective. It's a very select you're kind of presenting a very selective, I guess, part about yourself. And for kids, I think for them to see that content from others who seem like their peers, for them to see that and then be sort of, I think it creates a very competitive atmosphere. And I think the way the algorithms are designed to amplify that kind of content, I think going back to what you were saying about how Zuckerberg had said that like, oh, people do great things on our platforms. Kids love our platform because they get to express themselves, they get to create content, they get to do XYZ. I think it just goes to show that, you know, they're not willing to change their design. They strongly believe that like kids are benefiting from this kind of exchange. And then going back to that whole like, oh, there's no causal link between mental health and or like worsening mental health outcomes and social media usage kind of corroborates that attitude amongst, I think, a lot of these platforms that, hey, the way that we are numerically assigning value to content that's being created, how is that reconciled with this idea of content being a form of self-expression? Because I don't think that you can really equate true self-expression with some kind of number. And I think hearing your perspective, Ben, as a content creator who's on the other side, to see how these, not only are these platforms creating numerical incentives for children, like through likes or other forms of validation, but also for content creators to receive that similar kind of validation, but at an elevated magnitude, I think is very interesting because it's almost like they are kind of curating, like they thrive off of this competition. They thrive off of like this kind of addictive form of competition that they create on their platforms. And sure, it looks great to them and they can present it well to the public. They can be like, you're enjoying this, but how do we know that we're actually enjoying that? And I think that kind of consciousness is hard to achieve when you're actively addicted to these platforms, which is why I think a lot of our peers aren't realizing sort of where the problem is.
Right. And I think to kind of go off that, where some of our peers aren't realizing what the problem is, do you think that moments from the hearing, like, for example, Senator Cruz's line of questioning, which was very dramatic and elicited a huge response, or Senator Blumenthal's line of questioning, when those are clipped down into short form and are removed from the context, do you think consuming that content actively brings people into wanting to care more or pushes them away from that? If that question kind of makes sense, and Sam, you can jump in there. But seeing these senators and what you see in the comments is a lot of people kind of recognize that this is performative, and I think that it causes a little bit of resentment between the people who are viewing it and the senators who took opportunities to kind of put on a show for us. Not that they weren't incredibly important. I mean, for example, Senator Cruz's line of questioning was, I mean, it was insane for him to see content anyway, right there. That was such a point that needed to be hammered home. But Senator Cruz doesn't have exactly the best reputation for himself among people of our age. So it almost is kind of counterproductive to what he wants to do. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, Sam.
Yeah, I think I was alluding to this earlier with these elected officials not having previously really had their finger on the pulse when it comes to youth issues. And I think this was a change for that. And the reason that that happened is because this is such a massive issue. If you look at our generation and the rate of mental health problems we're experiencing, the massive increase in eating disorders, suicides, and political extremism, it's clear that this is an issue that can't be ignored. And that's why we're seeing more focus from these congressional offices that might not always have that degree of nuance. But I do think it's a nice narrative to be able to say, oh, they don't, our elected officials don't know what's going on online. And that's true a lot of the time, but in this case, it's not. And I think I think you're right. For example, more clips of those powerful moments of the hearing would be important. But again, this is such a complex issue to get into in the first place when you're talking about something like social media addiction. Does that mean something to most people? It probably does to some degree in terms of like, oh, my kids won't get off their phones or I can't get off my phone. But to really talk through those experiences and put words to it is why the advocacy we're doing right now is so important, because a lot of the ideas right now, like, oh, of course you're going to put on your seatbelt when you're in the car, were really strange when what initially became a thing. And that's where we're at with social media right now. But it's important that we do this kind of work to normalize these ideas and to get people used to talking about these issues so that when they see clips from the hearing, it's more meaningful to them.
Right. Like the hearing is too unsafe at any speed, as Ralph Nader was to the seatbelts. We are to the movement. I like that. Just kind of switch gears though and talk about moments of virality. And Zaman, you were talking about this earlier, so I'd be curious to hear your perspective on people like Senator Tom Cotton coming in and asking the Singaporean CEO, "Are you a member of the Chinese Communist Party?" Like, what kind of implications do accusations like this have on a hearing about child safety? And is this fear mongering to any degree? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is unfortunately like this hearing is just another congressional hearing at the end of the day. This kind of political theater happens with other high profile witnesses that come before Congress as well. And there was a really like stark moment for me when Pete Buttigieg was testifying before a House Oversight Committee hearing, and the last congressman comes up for his line of questioning. So like all the moments of virality have gone at this point. Everyone sucked all the juice out of that hearing. And the congressman goes, he's Republican, he goes, all my I'm paraphrasing here. He goes something to the degree of like, all the viral moments are gone out of this hearing now. So I'm actually just going to ask you some real questions about real issues that are affecting my district. And it's like, that's your job too. That's what every one of you should be doing. So I think bigger picture for me, I grow more cynical by the day that we don't pass legislation to protect kids and teens online, that Congress has the ability to legislate in this area. You know, we can go round in circles on like crafting the most, perfect, beautiful bill every few months, and we'll never get in a position that actually establishes any safeguards or basis for us to grow on as a country to actually build a legal framework or a doctrine that regulates social media companies. And every few months that passes by, we are still existing in the same status quo that existed before. To that degree, I'm going to go out on a limb here, maybe, and I give Zuckerberg the benefit of the doubt in that, you know, he's built this product, and the train has left the station, and so this is what it is. It's out there, and I'm absolutely sure he's probably had moments of self-reflection where he's been like, if it has what I have built actually been a net social good. And to that degree, it's like, at the end of the day, he's a CEO, so he has a fiduciary responsibility to simply providing revenue and profits for his shareholders. And he did come back with a legislative proposal to Congress. Granted, it's one that nobody thinks is actually worthwhile, and that should actually be implemented. But he did come back and say, hey, there's this idea that I think we should do. So I think to that end, it's like there's an equal amount of responsibility here that rests on these CEOs to have built products that actually were going to protect people online. But they were our age when they were building these products. And it's equally incumbent on these members of Congress to legislate and regulate, because that's their job. I think the last thing I'll say is, and maybe this is a little bit conspiratorial, but the last time that Xiao Qiu testified before the House, kind of to Ava, to your point, there were a lot of clips out there. There's that one of like, well, if you connect your device to the Wi-Fi, is your data like siphoned off or something? And that one stole the show. It's the same way that Tom Cotton's comment stole the show from this hearing. There were a lot of good questions that were asked throughout the hearing. There were a lot of good questions asked throughout that hearing, but social media and the attention economy will always capitalize on the moments of virality that suit the algorithm and suit what people are most interested in a polarizing way. And then when Xiao Qiu also testified, the kind of content that appeared on TikTok about him in the days leading up to the hearing and the days afterwards were so positive. And you have to think that these platforms can essentially dictate the social discourse around themselves when these hearings happen as well. So I think that's something to be mindful of when we're reading through these comments on TikTok. Yes, I'm sure it represents what a certain population of young people, or any people on social media for that matter, think about what they experienced on the hearing. But there'll be some people who won't ever sign into a social media app to comment about that hearing as well, and would have read about it in a newspaper and had a disgusted reaction at what they read and an outcry of fear or angst or, anger about what they were reading, and not comment about it on social media. So, I think there's levels to this as well. And there are sort of different versions of reality that we're living in here that have unfortunately become more and more removed from one another over time.
I really like that point, Saman, and I think it's really valid because it's social media. You forget about the opinions that aren't represented on your feed directly. And you get, like Sam said earlier, kind of that confirmation bias of, oh, well, this must be all that's out there then, right? And I had my kind of Zuckerberg sympathizer moment too, very, very briefly, because I thought he was 20 years old when he made this product, and he was very heavily celebrated for it for a very, very, very long time. He was the king of the castle, like he was on top of the world, and then to have that rug pulled out from under you all of a sudden. I mean, of course it's due to your own greed and absolute inability to pay attention to people when they're saying that you need help. But I'm really, really curious if, and anyone can answer this question, but if you could wave one magic wand and have Zuckerberg himself, not even regulatory, but have Zuckerberg himself change one thing about the platform, and this would go on to, you know, it would work for all of the other platforms, but what would that one thing that you could change be?
I would make it so that he would open up the amount of data that researchers could take. We would get a really big council of researchers who specialize in the subject from a variety of different perspectives and positions. And they would do research on how social media is affected by mental health. It would be funded not by Meta, but by some independent source. And whatever recommendations they would argue for and they would recommend, Mark Zuckerberg would implement.
Super valid. What about you, Sam?
For me, it's simple. I think it's about the algorithms. And if Mark Zuckerberg could do one thing, I would want him to ensure that no user-related data, not just your personal data, but also the data relating to your usage on the platform, like how long you spend looking at a certain type of post and what you're liking, and your cookies from other websites are not being used in those content recommendation algorithms. There's a lot of issues with social media that wouldn't be neatly solved by that, such as social comparison, and the way everything is becomes a numbers game. But I think that would go a long way to make social media something that's more based around who you're following and seeing a wide degree of perspectives across different people who believe different things and different demographics, rather than just seeing your personalized echo chamber based on what you'll be interested in and what will keep you scrolling.
Right. How about you, Sanvi?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if this is like realistic, but I think somewhat moving some of the research that's going on, some of the data, I guess like oversight on how data is being collected, or I guess even how these algorithms are amplifying certain information, that kind of oversight and moderation to not be as in-house as it is right now, because I think that makes it really hard for us as users and as like other interest groups to actually get a grasp on what's going on and trust what they're saying. Because, you know, like it's really easy to be like, hey, I'm studying my own platform. I understand how it works. And I personally don't think that I built this platform with this intention. So therefore, it's not doing that. Like, it's really easy to kind of get stuck in that mentality. And I feel like that's sort of going back to like the sympathy with Zuckerberg, kind of like a line that we were talking about earlier. That's sort of where I was at. I think at the end of it was like, you know, like he did just create this platform. Probably, like, I don't think, I would like to hope he didn't create this platform to create a democracy problem or create like an individualism issue, or like the myriad of, or like a mental health crisis, the myriad of other issues that it ended up unfolding to become. And you know, there are benefits to platforms, like to social media in general, that we have already talked about. And I think it would be refreshing to move some of that. I think not just in Meta, but industry wide, move some of that conversation, that really the technical conversations that they're probably having in house, to some third party environment. And yeah, there are definitely probably concerns with that, but part of me also feels like we're going to we're going to be stuck in this feedback loop that is only just feedback, when it's stuck inside when that kind of discussion is stuck within like the confines of very confidential or like corporate structures. So yeah, that's where
Right.
I'm at.
No, that's unfortunately super real. What about you, Simon?
Mine's really basic. I mean, all of you guys, I completely agree with, but I would just turn off the like counts by default on Instagram. And I think that is in recognition of greater changes to the platform. If you read the lawsuits that 41 plus attorneys general have filed against Meta, they discuss Project Daisy, an internal research study that found that if you turn off like counts by default for younger users, well-being improves on the platform. And so that research was presented to executives. Executives had the option to implement it, and it ultimately never got implemented by default. It's an option, but it's the percentage of opt-in is, you know, marginal. And yeah, a Meta employee is quoted in these lawsuits as saying is, if we can't do something as basic as this for well-being, then how can we think and fathom about doing anything else that's going to be far more impactful for well-being? So I guess my point is like, do this, take this very simple step that you know is going to improve the platform, is not very contentious. This is not free speech or democracy or, you know, heavy regulation on the platform. This is something as simple as turning off your like counts by default. You can turn them back on if you want to. That basic change pushes the platform in a direction that actually, you know, gets to a place where platforms can evolve and change in a way that is grounded in safety. But right now, the status quo is that we get these band-aid measures every couple of months when we have these hearings. And then, you know, everyone goes about their days like normal.
Right. I think I'm somewhere between you and Sam. I mean, I really liked all those answers. I wish we could do all of them, obviously. Whatever, shoot for the stars. But I think somewhere between turning off like counts and changing the way that algorithms can interpret data. Because I get really freaked out. I mean, there's the mental health issue, but I get really freaked out about our democracy. And I think that's something that we lose sight of during the mental health conversation. And I'd be curious to hear you all's opinions on this. We get so concerned about the children, as we naturally should be, that we almost forget these products damage people who are not children too. And they damage our democracy as well. And they are polarizing us and they're turning us apart from each other. But I feel like to kind of bring a hopeful note in there, I think that us young people do recognize the problem with that and that we do want to stop it. So I guess my next question for y'all is, if you could help someone who's on the outside of this movement, who doesn't understand one thing about what social media is kind of doing, what would that be? And I'll start. I would go down the Senator Kennedy route and be like, do you know how important your personal information is? And do you know that you're essentially giving it away to these people so they can make billions of dollars? But people don't know why their personal data is important. So I think that would be mine, was trying to explain to people that if a company has their hands on your personal data, they can exploit your greatest vulnerabilities and your most subconscious weaknesses that you don't even know necessarily exist until you see that taken into account and then manifesting itself back to you on your feed. But I'd be curious what you guys would share with someone who's kind of on the outside looking in. And whoever can start.
Yeah, I think there's a great point there about data privacy. I think a lot of people in the responsible tech movement come from that very pro data privacy lens. And that wasn't really my experience coming into this movement. Like, I thought it was an important issue, but not a priority for me, as it is with a lot of people. So for me, what really flipped the switch was seeing how that data was being exploited to keep me online for as long as possible and to feed me more and more extreme content, all in that name of getting more scrolls so that they could show me more ads and generate more money. And then what I do whenever I'm talking to people about this issue, even if it's an elected official, is just relate it back to personal experience. Because even though these issues take time to understand, the basics are there for everyone. Hence why this is such a massive issue. Is you go to anyone and you talk about, have you ever had the experience of going on social media and having like a 5-minute break, and the next thing you know, you've been scrolling for an hour? Almost everyone can relate to that. Whether you're old or young, Facebook's algorithm is addictive as well as Instagram and TikTok now. So that's a pretty universal experience that I think shows the platform of these apps. And then when you translate to, imagine your 12-year-old daughter or granddaughter, if you're talking to an older legislator, imagine them on these apps, and imagine how they don't have the same self-regulation that you have, how they're going to be unable to break away. It's clear how it can get really scary. And then the other thing I would say is just talk to real young people in your life. For every individual who wants to learn about this issue, you talk to young people and you will hear stories about young people on the platform seeing healthy eating content and maybe looking at it for a second too long. And the next thing they know, their feed is full of extreme dieting tips and other content that leads them down pipelines to develop eating disorders. So you just have to have these serious, hard conversations with young people, and the data is all there, and it's really clear just on an experience basis how these platforms are harmful to young users.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the storytelling piece is really, really important because I think that a lot of the times, especially when we're talking to peers, it's a lot easier to relate to a story or to an experience than it is to relate to data, especially like data in like the like analysis, like 99% of, I don't know, like whatever the statistics are that you would want to be referring to. And I think that it's also been interesting to talk to young people about the pervasive effects of social media consumption, not just on their mental health, but on their ability to trust American institutions. And I think we were talking about like democracy earlier, and I feel like a lot of our generation is very in tune with how and agrees that social media has been divisive in terms of creating has divided communities and has had a lot of impact on I know at least like we as young people have grown up consuming a lot of information about current events or about the world online. So we have honestly like developed almost an innate sense of like discerning between disinformation and truth. But I don't think that that is something that the general American public has the skills to really do right now. And we saw the impacts of that in 2020. We are already talking about that again with this year's presidential. And I think that that is an interesting conversation for me. That has been, it's been interesting to see how a lot more of our peers, or at least my peers, have been open to conversations around like the dangers around mental health or around social media in the context of like that. But you know, and that has sort of led them to understand more about where their data might be used elsewhere, and how you know, these platforms might be harming them in other ways. And I feel like that in has been interesting. But I do agree that even in conversations that we've had with survivors of child sexual abuse and who've had their child sexual abuse material like spread on these platforms, being able to explain to others that, you know, the honestly disgusting ways that predators are actually able to leverage these platforms, and the many like protections almost that these platforms give them to do that has been eye-opening for a lot of people. And I think stories and an experience-based approach has been the crux of that for us here. So I definitely agree with what Sam was saying.
Yeah, I agree with both Sanvi and Sam. I think the way that I typically engage with this is that you have really perverse impacts of social media that get put front and center in these hearings and in a lot of our activism. It's the work that people like Sanvi are on the edge of pretty much constantly as it relates to CSAM. You know, the other examples are around suicide and eating disorder and really challenging mental health challenges. But then you have this large majority of the country's youth, of teenagers and young people across the country, who have simply felt bad about themselves because of something that they saw on social media, even whether it's for a short amount of time or for a protracted amount of time. And that's the group of people also worth regulating, legislating, and advocating for. Because, yeah, I think it's as advocates, sometimes we have to find the most convincing emotional story to impact these change makers, these people in positions of power. But the vast majority of young people that I speak to are like, damn, I just spend too much time on Instagram and I don't want to be doing that. And we can have positive experiences with social media. I think that is possible. I think you and I are able to do that because we understand the harms so much so that we have tried to build our experiences on social media, recognizing what our peers and our friends and ourselves have had to go through. But for the vast majority of people who, to all of your points, don't necessarily understand why the monetization and collection of your data is of concern, or why it's a bad thing that you are spending hours and hours on social media. That's the core, I think, of the work that all of us do, is that there is a majority of people out there who have experienced something on social media, and those are the people that we are also advocating for at the end of the day.
What about you, Ben?
What was the question again? I kind of forgot now.
If you could say, and I mean, this is kind of this is what you do every day, but if you could help explain just one thing to somebody who doesn't absolutely understand, what would that be? And how would you do it?
Yeah. So my answer to this starts always the same, which is that it would be very different if I could talk to them in person. Because when someone asks us a question, the best way that you can give an answer is by asking follow-up questions to better understand why they're asking and how they're asking. But a general recommendation that I give for people is I encourage them to spend less time on their phones, spend more time reading, spend less time, especially around night, so that you're able to get better sleep. You'll think you're an insomniac you'll think it to the core of your heart. You'll think, do or die. This is who I am, that my internal clock, my circadian rhythm is set to 3 a.m. And then you get off your phone and then all of a sudden you can sleep at 11 or 12. I like to recommend the book Amusing Yourselves to Death by Neil Postman. It's one of the most influential books I've ever read my entire life. But I think most of all, it's that, we can talk about large sociological theories, but ultimately what works best for individual people is an individual question. And the best way that they can answer that for themselves is if they really have an acute cultured awareness and an acute kind of structured curiosity where they're able to really observe what works for them and what doesn't. And that takes a level of scrutiny that 5 mindless hours spent on your phone doesn't have. And so, think about your moments where you're most fulfilled in life. Think about the people that you love like crazy and how your best moments with them, and think about how many times those moments have been on or with or around social media, or if those moments have been around other things, and then do those. And if it's around social media, then do that. But if it's not, then do that other stuff.
Yeah. I think that's really great. And I think that's a great spot to wrap up, but just to make sure that we're ending on a positive note and that we're putting positive things into the universe, because I'm big on that. What is one thing super quick that we can do to make sure that this moment is the tipping point and that the only thing we're doing from here on out is going forward after this hearing, and that we're not backtracking in any way? I guess mine would probably be stay as actively engaged with your staffers and your representatives. I mean, that's from the advocacy point of view, but do not stop calling offices now that this is getting a lot of press. And real quick, if y'all want to offer some positive insights to end this out. Sam, you can go first.
I'm on the same boat as you with the advocacy. I think that's going to be really important for, we've seen a lot of proposals in this space and a lot of different ideas. And I think it's time for us to come together and get a broader audience for this stuff, not just the tech policy specialists, but let's start talking to everybody and really seeing movement. And then just from an advocacy lens, as an organization, the Young People's Alliance is now thinking a lot more about the public facing side of this. I think for so long, it was about convincing civil society that this was necessary and a good idea. And we've pretty much gotten there. I think that was very apparent from the way that the senators largely knew what they were talking about, that education campaign with political leaders has been successful. Now it's a matter of talking to the general public about this issue. So I hope to see a lot more action like this panel, like the hearing, and then the protest afterwards, to continue to increase awareness of these issues, and hopefully some really thoughtful education as well. And people across the country can start having conversations about these issues from a policy lens and not just from an individual lens.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I agree with what both of you said, and also just jumping off of what Zaman was saying earlier about how this is like the way that I think this issue has traditionally been discussed has very much gone over a lot of people's heads, in the sense that they'll be like, oh, this doesn't apply to me, or like, I haven't experienced XYZ, what they're talking about. So therefore, like, social media has had no negative impact on me, and I'm going to keep going on TikTok for hours and looking at the tarot card readings or whatever, you know? So it's like, essentially, like, I feel like that's what the sentiment has been like. And I think your point being that, we are at a tipping point where we can make this conversation more accessible to the general public. And I think really providing that lens as young people ourselves to go out and talk to our peers, and couple this individualistic approach that values actually creating consciousness at the individual level, that like, hey, this is how I've been interacting with this platform and it hasn't benefited me and hasn't served me for XYZ reason. Complementing that with like a collective approach, that creates that broader change that we've been trying to advocate for. And I think that the biggest, or not the biggest, but I think one overwhelming sentiment that we kind of all captured when we were talking about the policy side earlier was that, like, yeah, there's acknowledgement that that harm has been done, but there's simultaneously been like a dialogue online that might point towards the general public not seeing this as big of an issue as we are saying it is. And um, I think we have an opportunity to really, I think, shift that narrative and bring this to a broader public focus, and ultimately create that momentum that we really need. And so, yeah, it's gonna be, we got this. Yay.
Yeah, I agree with everything that has been said. Um, we are all here on this Zoom panel because Design It For Us and the broader responsible youth tech movement is like moving, and we're all here because it's growing and it's going to continue to grow. And so the more people that we can bring into this movement, the more people that we can, you know, we have a luxury of being able to think about social media and digital well-being. Somebody earlier today mentioned that so many of us are in survival mode when it comes to the way that we're simply living. And so the ability to think about your online environment and the way that you're interacting with that online space is a luxury. And so it's incumbent on us, I think, to translate why that's important for everyone and bring more people into the space, regardless of where their status is in life.
I think the last thing that I'd like to add is that we all, like, everyone on the Zoom panel cares about this a lot, and there are a million problems in this world. Like, there's climate change, and then there's like problems with AI, and there's like 1,000,000,000 bajillion things that you can focus on and get yelled at on your phone and call your senator about. And I think it's important to just also say that it's much better to live an idea than to die preaching it. And if this is stressing you the hell out, and you don't know, it stresses you so much that you scroll mindlessly to kind of avoid this, there are very few things in life that really, really matter. I think everyone here is paying attention to this because they've realized that there's very few things that matter, and so you got to focus on the most important things. And so please definitely participate in this if that's one of those things for you. But if it's not, uh, there's 1,000,000,000 people who are dying and need your advocacy work to help them out right now, right? There's like this huge thing. It's crazy. And there's 1,000,000,000 influencers who want your attention right now and want to make you feel like you belong. And you can shut that off and spend time with your family members and your friends and sleep. And it's okay to not have Atlas's shoulders. So I think that's an important thing as well.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great place to end. It's really important to make sure that you're staying healthy and staying well and having a nice balance going on, because you can't advocate for anything if you're too tired to advocate for yourself. So I think that's excellent. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. I really am super excited to be a part of this conversation and to hear all of you guys' amazing insights. I feel really grateful to be in the movement. a part of this conversation with all of y'all who offer such diverse and incredible perspectives. So thank you so much. Please go do your schoolwork. Best of luck. And I am sure I will see you all very, very, very soon. Perfect.